I'm going to remove the top end on this 1983 R80ST. I'll remove the valve cover and then all the valve gear underneath it, and then the head, and then I'll pull the cylinder, and then I'll remove the piston off the connecting rod. And I'll take the connecting rods off at a later time. So it's a pretty straightforward process. So this is the valve gear that's underneath the valve cover, and the cover attaches with two studs that go here, and then there's a center stud which goes in here. Now on this bike, all of that hardware was missing. The cover was just on there loosely. Now in order to remove the valve gear, I'll loosen the nuts that are holding the rocker assembly, and then I'll pull those off as a unit. Before I remove these nuts that are holding the rocker arms onto the head, they're on a stud that runs all the way into the engine block. And sometimes those studs in the engine block have come loose and the threads are stripped. So now's the time to test and be sure they're good. So I've set my torque wrench to 25 foot-pounds, and we'll see if everybody's happy. That's good. That's good. That's good. That's good. Okay, so all of the cylinder studs are intact and there's no stripped threads in the engine block. So I loosened the nuts in a crosswise pattern a little bit at a time, and also the nuts at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock, because I want to take the pressure off the head slowly just to keep from warping anything. So now that I've got the nuts all backed off, I'm ready to remove the whole rocker assembly, and it'll just slide right off like that. Now this is the left intake, and I already put the nuts in a bag labeled left intake. So I'm going to put that rocker assembly in that bag right now so I don't get confused, because I definitely want to make sure all the valve gear goes back where it came from. Now this is the push rod, and I also want it to go back the right way, with this being the top and the other end being the bottom. So I made up a tag that I'm going to put on it that says left intake top. Now the reason for that is that this little ball gets polished to mate the valve in here there on the cam, the follower, and also it mates up on the top with the tappet. So I just want to keep everything in the right orientation when I put it back together. So I removed the nuts at 6 o'clock and 12 o'clock, and they have a thick washer underneath them, and I pulled that off with a magnet. Now I usually use my gentle persuader to get the head to come loose from the cylinder, so I can just slide it off the studs, and it slides right off, and there's the head. This is the cylinder, this is the head gasket, and that's the piston, with about the usual expected amount of carbon buildup. I used my soft persuader and tapped on the cylinder to break it free of the sealant, and then carefully pull it back. Now what you'll notice here is that there are a couple of O-rings. There's one here on each of the top cylinder studs, and there's another one here in the base, which are oil seals. Now the other thing I've done is I took some garden wire, wrapped it around the top two studs, and this is the connecting rod. I put it under the connecting rod because when I pull the cylinder all the way off, I don't want that connecting rod to fall down onto the case because it'll nick it. So I just keep wiggling the cylinder and it comes off. And this, of course, is the piston and rings, and I'll remove those here in just a second. Now to remove the piston, I have to get it so I can push the wrist pin out. And this is the wrist pin, and it's held in place with a locking ring that I use my lock ring pliers to expand so it'll come off. And then I push the wrist pin through, and it just slides right out, and then the piston slides right off. So it's a pretty straightforward operation to remove the piston off the connecting rod. And the other thing I did for insurance is I put a rag underneath the connecting rod. Again, I don't want that rod to drop and nick the case, because if you do that, you're going to get an oil leak. So the wrist pin is off and the piston is off. So this is where the push rod tubes go, and the push rods sit on top of a little cylinder inside, which is called a cam follower. Now I want to remove these and inspect them to be sure that they're in good shape. And I want to also be sure that when I take them out, I return them to exactly where they came from. So I'll put them in the bags that I have labeled for the rocker assemblies, and that way I'll make sure I get the cam follower in the right space. Now, you might think you can remove that follower just using a magnet to pull it out, but I don't want to do that because it'll magnetize the follower and it can attract very small bits of steel, and then that could get underneath the face of the follower and the face of the cam, and that would damage them. So I don't want to do that. What I do is I take a paper clip, and there's a hole right in the middle of the follower, which is an oil lubrication passage, and I can slide the paper clip in and then kind of bend it down a little bit, and I can get the follower to come right out. Now what I'm looking for is any cracks along the side, of which I don't currently see anything. And the other thing I want to look at is the face. And it ought to be like a mirror with no pitting or scratches. And this one is perfect. So I'll pull the others and check them and make sure there's no damage. So I've got the top end off the motor, and both sides came out looking pretty nice. No real damage that I could see. And of course up here are all the parts that I removed, the heads and the cylinders and the pistons and the valve covers and the valve gear. So the next thing is to remove the engine from the frame.